everyone. It is your professor for HIST 140, Derek Taylor. This is my weekly video, preview of this week's module, this week's readings. A couple things before we get started. I'm going to go over the readings fairly quickly today and give you guys some feedback, some responses to the feedback you left for me on the feedback forums this week, which were, by the way, for both sections. I have 351, 352, very helpful. I'm going to respond to all your questions here. So thank you guys, the guys who took the time to do that. It's very helpful for me. I hope I can give you some help in this video and some other ways as well. So also send out emails tomorrow morning as well. So a couple of things for this week, briefly about the readings. You're going to have Chapter 5 and then the first part of Chapter 6 in the America textbook, which will take you from 1763 up through the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783. So we're covering the 10 years or so before the declaration of war begins in 1776 between the American colonies and the British government and the winning of the war. So, and what you're going to get there is how things break down from the time, the British win the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War in North America, and they become the great power in Europe. They had not been really the dominant power. France had been the dominant power in Europe, but the 7 Years' War alters things altogether. All of a sudden, Britain is revealed with its great navy, with its great colonial possessions, because after the 7 Years' War, not only do they control most of North America in European terms, they control India, which will become their crown jewel in their empire going forward. So they become a global power within, and actually they'd already been building toward that. But the 7 Years' War revealed that to the rest of the European powers, which is not unimportant for the American colonies because the people they defeated, the French especially, will be plotting ways to get back at the British. Way things work in the 18th century, there's sort of a balance of power in which when France was the great power, the other powers tried to gang up against them, to prevent them from becoming too powerful in Europe. Well, the same thing is going to happen for the British after 1763. And you're also going to have in 1763 the beginnings of a conflict between the American colonies and the British government because, of course, you've learned about the idea of salutary neglect from your readings, in which, again, the British government had bigger fish to fry, so they let the colonies do as they pleased to develop their own political traditions, essentially without much interference from the British government in London. All of a sudden, after 1763, things change. Now, of course, you have large numbers of British troops in North America for the first time. Not only did they have to defend, of course, the colonists during the war from the French, they also now have signed treaties with the Indian nations to the west of the colonies, which for the most part the colonists don't really respect. They want to keep pushing west, whereas the British want to keep those boundaries in place. They don't want to have to go fight another war with these Indians. So that becomes a source of tension. What also becomes a source of tension is that the British have run up a pretty big debt during the war, and they've never really directly taxed the colonies, but they figure, hey, we provided for your defense during the war. The colonies should pay up and help pay for the troops we're putting in North America. And this will lead to a big constitutional conflict. It will go from being about taxation to being about things like the right of representation. Can the Parliament tax colonists in the New World if they don't have their own representatives in Parliament? And so there'll be a big back and forth about the legality of all this. And this is what will build up. Eventually, you'll have resistance growing in the colonies. From the very beginning, almost sort of quasi-violent resistance, emerging into violence in the early 1770s, a sort of brutal British response, and this will lead into, of course, will become the American Revolutionary War, the War for Independence, which will be the end of this week's chapter. Next week, actually, we'll talk about the creation of a constitution, because as you're going to see, there are a couple attempts at it. We actually have two different constitutions, written constitutions in this country. But that'll come a little later, of course. They won't get things quite right until 1787. So this is about the build-up and the background behind the conflict between the mother government in London and the colonies, and then, of course, the Revolutionary War itself. Now, in terms of feedback, and by the way, I want to thank everyone again for your feedback, leaving feedback who did this it really helps me. I'm hoping, as in a larger sense, some of the changes I need to make, I'll probably have to make next semester when I teach the course. But even in this course, I'm going to try to adjust some things for you if I can do this. So thank you all very much. This is our little quarterly experiment I'm doing. I've never done this before, so hopefully it'll help out. It has helped me already. You'll do this another 4 weeks, basically. Give me some feedback, and that's great. And so I wanted to respond to some of the concerns you guys had. Mostly, and I thank you for it. You were kind of positive about it. I hope the course is clear for you. I hope the assignments make sense. The first thing I want to talk about is discussion. I know some of you had some problems with the discussion rubric. Maybe it wasn't clear enough or whatever, and I'm putting a big emphasis on, you ask questions, you need to ask factual stuff. I understand that, and I didn't mean to press that too much, but I want at least a couple of the questions that you post to be a little more sophisticated, and that's why I give you the rubric of, comparison questions, which some of you guys have done a good job with, but also analytical questions, and most of you, by the way, have done fine with this. It may be kind of hard to understand what I'm getting at when I say analysis, right? And so some of you asked for examples. I actually sent an email out with some examples. I'll resend that email out for you, what analysis questions look like. But usually it's something like, and you can think of these things when you analyze, for example, take the 7 Years' War. You just read about that in the book. Say I post a question, the 7 Years' War altered the relationship between the American colonies and the British Empire. And a factual question would ask that question as, okay, what effects did the 7 Years' War have on the relationship between the American colonies and the British government? That's a factual question. You can answer that with a few statements. You can ask the same question, though, and turn that into an analytical question. Instead of asking, okay, what were the effects, you can say, what was the most important effect on the relationship between the colonies and the relationship between the colonies and the British government as a result of the 7 Years' War? That means, because what's most important, of course, requires you to analyze things more closely. You can't just recite facts. You have to take those facts and kind of interpret them and evaluate them. And that's what we're doing when you analyze things. And so that's an example of what I mean when I say looking for that type of question in your posts. Which, again, most of you guys have done a good job. I appreciate it. I know it's a kind of a nitpicking demand I make of you. But I do that to give you some practice, basically, for doing that for your papers. When you're going to have to think in larger terms than just, okay, who was George Whitefield? What did he do? Factual answer. Okay, what was the significance of his role? Why was he important? You're getting to larger questions other than just reciting facts, which, by the way, I don't want to denigrate the notion of you guys, learning factual detail from this course. I probably maybe overemphasize analysis too much. One of the big things you've seen from the syllabus in my course, I want you to get as much as is possible in a single online course. Some of the skills and habits that are necessary to do history, basically. Not that you're going to be professional historians, any of you, but it's a good skill to have. Research skills, by the way, are portable. You can take those into different fields. I mean, if any of you are planning to go into the legal professions, even the medical professions, you'll have to do research. You'll have to write reports. And again, it's different in terms of the questions you're asking and the answers you want to get. But for the most part, research is kind of research. And so hopefully this will be helpful for you in a more general sense. But I wanted you to get those particular habits and skills that a historian would use if you wanted to sit down and, hey, maybe later in your life when you're retired, you'll want to write a local history of your town somewhere. If you're living, maybe you're from Kansas, a town that has a little unique history no one's written about. You can go to the local public library, the local archive. You can write down your own little history. As to everything about it, you don't have to be an academic historian. And the same methods, the same skills that someone like that would use, or a popular historian, is what an academic historian does. So I'm hoping giving you these more general skills, and I emphasize that. But I didn't mean to emphasize that to the exclusion of factual data. Which brings me to the second question some of you asked, especially in my first section, 351. Some of you had questions about the quizzes, and both of you, by the way, both of my sections, the quiz grades have gone down. Quiz grades have gone down last couple of weeks. And in terms of, I'm going to do something to try to help you with that. I know it's kind of difficult to know what to prepare for those quizzes. I choose these questions, by the way, from a test bank based on the textbook. And for the most part, I choose either factual type questions. I believe I've also included map questions. You have to know, where battles occurred and where significant things occurred and where in North America and in the United States. But a lot of the questions I pick especially because they're not really factual questions. Again, they're more of these things where you have to think about them for a little bit. And in particular, you'll have questions where there'll be four answers, right? And all of them may have something about them that's true. There may be four answers where, yeah, part of this answer is true, but part of it makes it either false outright or makes it less plausible than other answers. In other words, when I say you have to choose the best answer from the four given, you have to rank them relative to each other when you answer the question. That's what's, I think, causing some of you difficulties. To give you an example, on the last exam, someone emailed me about a question with regards to slave rebellions, I think it was about, in the 18th century. And one of the answers that the student chose was slave rebellions were very rare, and slaves didn't even bother to dissent against their slave masters. They were so beaten down. That was the answer, basically. I think that was the question. The question was, what statement is most true about slaves in the 18th century? And the first part of that statement, just to give you an idea of what you do when you go answer these questions, is true. There were very few. There's only one major rebellion in the 18th century, slave rebellion, the Stono Rebellion in 1739 in South Carolina. A few other minor ones. But the key phrase there came at the end of that sentence in that answer. Slaves didn't rarely dissent. They dissented all the time. They ran away. They would, sabotage their tools, stuff like this. They would bargain with their masters for better pay, for better conditions. And it says that clearly in the textbook. And so you need to pay careful attention when you read through and again, this sounds dull and boring and painstaking. And my answer to that is yes. That's what you do when you study history. You're looking at sources, and you're going over things painstakingly, so that you get down the right information, so that you can evaluate it, interpret it the way you need to. And that's why when you do these answers and these quizzes, you really need to pay attention to what each of them say. Again, sometimes it'll just be a factual question. This is why, by the way, recognizing what a factual question is versus an analytical one is helpful for you in discussion, because it helps you with the quizzes. It will help you, as you're going to see on the midterm, which we'll talk about in a second. And so, yeah, and I mention this because I don't want you to think, by the way, some of you have said you take detailed notes on the chapters in America, and that hasn't helped you much on the quizzes. And I guess something I probably should have addressed, I'm going to address it now, in terms of how you take notes for the quizzes, what you write down, because you don't ever know exactly what you're going to need to know on the quizzes. But in general, and some of you, by the way, I know in my classes, you didn't grow up in the United States, so you don't have as good a background with some of the history. So you don't have already some of the historical knowledge that some of the students here have. Some of you, of course, are taking your first American history class, even though you're from America. You haven't taken an American history course since you were a freshman in high school, which may be 4 or 5, 6, 7 years ago, maybe even longer. So you've forgotten a lot of this. So this is where I think maybe I should emphasize the factual, fact gathering side of history a little more. And so when you're taking notes, first of all, on the America textbook chapters, you want to write down, at least underline or know, in terms of factual things to remember, first of all, names of, big political leaders, presidents, military figures, right? Who they are, why they're important. Those are big things you should take notes on. There'll be questions like that on the quizzes. Important battles that were a big, turning point in the war. I think there's a question next week on the quiz on the American Revolutionary War. There's one particular battle that's a turning point in the war. You should know what that is, right? It's just a name. It's a turning point. You'll know what that is. Some of you, one person also asked about things like dates, and I don't, for the most part, stress dates. But here's and I mentioned, well, I'll go back to the things she's write down. Military figures, political figures. You should also take note of, important ideas Now, sometimes we'll talk about ideas in the textbook. Last chapter, you learned about the Enlightenment. You should know what the Enlightenment is. You know what that's an intellectual movement, but we know what goes into that, generally speaking. You should know about cultural or religious phenomena like the Great Awakening. We mentioned the Great Awakening, very important. It's actually a set of revivals that goes on for religious Christian revivals that goes on for several decades. But know what that is. Know what that phrase means. That'll be helpful for you. And of course, who were important figures in that? People like George Whitefield, and so on and so forth. And so anything like that, it's factual, you should probably write down and know something about. A good way to do this, by the way, without having to write down extra notes, is you do this, if you take a look at your textbook. I'll put this up here actually for you. At the end of each chapter, this is the end of chapter 5. I'm going to show you here in your textbook. They have very helpful, well, they have summaries for the first part at the end of every chapter. They also have very helpful timelines. You can sort of see this here. You can't see it very well there, but those timelines will list. And again, some people have asked me about dates. Well, all these dates are kind of confusing. For the most part, you're not going to need to know too many dates, but again, a date's significant if it's connected to a significant event, right? And an event is something, a singular event, right? Like a big battle, right? That's a significant event. The Battle of Quebec in the 7 Years' War is a significant event. You need to know the year that takes place. That's just an example, by the way. Dates are only significant as far as they're connected to things. That's why those timelines are pretty helpful at the end of each chapter. Taking a look at those. Just for example, in chapter 5, it lists 1765 and mentions the Stamp Act. You will need to know what the Stamp Act is for the next quiz. Just FYI, it's important to know what that is, right? It's a law that was passed, why it's important, that sort of thing. That's a good way. That's a way to help you sort of study for things. But any sort of the event, person, political figure, any sort of intellectual idea, any sort of cultural or intellectual or political movement, all those are sort of factual things you need to know and write down. It's a general description. I know it's not too specific, but I generally don't ask questions about obscure things on these quizzes. I either focus on factual stuff or those questions where you kind of have to, again, choose the right answer, and they can be kind of tricky. That's one of the good things, actually, about multiple choice exams. They can give you, and again, this is one of the things I'm trying to teach you is skills, is to decide which answer is best. But it's not absolute, right? It's not like mathematics. There's a right and a wrong answer. There may be several answers that could be right, but one's more right than the others. And so that's what I'm wanting you to do and learn how to do based on doing history here. So when you take notes in terms of factual data, you should definitely think in terms of like big ticket ideas, events, figures, cultural and intellectual movements. And hopefully that'll help you out a little bit going forward. I don't know if that's as specific as some of you need, but if you need more specifics, email me. I'll try to help you out a little bit. I should mention also, by the way, if you're having trouble with note-taking, I don't know, most of you are taking this online, so maybe it's not an option for you. At Johnson County Community College, we have classes you can take for credit, on things like note-taking. Go to the website. I can't remember what it's called, but there are classes that will help you learn how to take notes. And it's a skill, by the way, I wish I had someone who taught to me when I learned how to do it in college, but it's very difficult. Okay, what's important to write down, what's not? And so, because again, someone like me, I've gone through college, graduate school, I have a PhD, you just sort of pick it up without thinking about it too much. For most of you, you're going to have to do that intentionally. So I urge you, if you have a chance to get on campus, take one of those courses. It's a good thing. Google the internet. There are strategies for taking notes that can help you out besides what I've told you here. So try to do that if you could. And also the quizzes, more generally speaking, again, they're open note, open book. So again, I can't make them any more easier than that in terms of what you're doing and taking them. Somebody suggested dropping maybe the lowest grade, because they do hurt your grade, by the way. You need to get better. I mean, the grades have lowered the last couple of weeks. I think one section was 70% was the average, 71% was the other average. That's not great. You guys need to get those scores up because they really hurt. It's 15% of your grade. And I'm leaning toward doing that. I may actually do that, drop the lowest grade at the end of the semester. Maybe in the future, next semester, I'll try to change it where I do emphasize factual stuff a little more, because that's really what I want those quizzes to be, is they give you a factual base where you have to remember that stuff, and you take the facts and you use them in discussion and in the papers you're going to write. But I'm probably going to make that change at some point, change the grading rubric for that. So don't worry too much about it, but try to do better on the quizzes. I know it's a lot of reading stuff, other stuff to do, but it's important for your grade going forward. The last thing I want to mention, and most of you guys, by the way, have gotten the hang of the discussion forum. Some of you are still doing, I don't think you've quite caught on the reasons or how you want to ask, factual, what a factual question is, right? I gave you an example already, but most of you have gotten the hang of like, okay, I need to ask something more specific, more analytical than say just, okay, what major battle happened in 1776? Something like that. What was the most important? Something more than that, where you're analyzing, where you're asking a more, if you like, qualitative question. Because you can answer, for example, okay, how many people, what's the best estimate for how many people existed in the colony, how many were living in the colonies at the start of the American Revolution? Yeah, you can give an estimate. I think it's around several million, 3 or 4 million, something like that. That's a factual question. But an evaluative question would be something like, what do you think were the motivations of the people who fought the American Revolution? And you have to evaluate, because we don't know precisely. We have some factual data to tell us why people were fighting, but not others. And that's a more evaluative question, or a comparison question where you say, okay, you have the uproar over the Stamp Act in 1765, where the American colonists rejected having to pay taxes without being represented without having the representatives bargain for this stuff in Parliament. A comparison would be, okay, how is that similar to certain movements in American politics today where people don't want to pay taxes? What are the differences? What are the similarities? That would be a comparative question. But those are the types of, again, once you move toward that, again, asking factual questions is fine, but you only get one of those for discussion. Once you focus on analyzing, historical movements, historical ideas. Again, give me an example of analyzing ideas, right? The textbook gives you a definition of the Enlightenment. And you can ask, okay, what do you think was the most important effect of the Enlightenment on the American colonies during the colonial period, and why, right? And so, okay, you have to evaluate. Okay, it had, what effects it had, right? It had, Benjamin Franklin. He does all these experiments. You have people being influenced by the English philosopher John Locke. Those sorts of things. But then you have to evaluate what you think is most important and give a reason for it. And that's an analysis question. And again, not all of them have to be that way, but it's a good rule of thumb to think in those terms. And again, most of you are doing pretty good with this. I'm glad you're hanging in there. Again, I know it's a little nitpicky, but it is, by the way, when I say these are skills historians are using, this is what I'm doing right now. I'm actually writing an article on the English philosopher John Locke, on his medical career. He's also a doctor in addition to being a philosopher. And I'm doing the same thing. And this gets me to the last thing I want to talk about. We'll get to discussion in a second, but in terms of note-taking, some of you asked about the notes you take, the responses, which meant that the response assignments, by the way, are just meant to give you experience taking notes on sources, so you can use those notes when you write the midterm essay and then the final essay. And I think one person's asked me, am I doing this right or wrong? Well, it depends. It's right or wrong according to what you need to write your essays. When you take these notes, you should literally have the assignment for the midterm essay in front of you, right? Okay, I'm taking notes on these essays. What's going to help me answer the question? The question's right here in front of me. I have it. Basically, the question is, what long-term developments had shaped American national identity by the 1800s? Because we only get about 1820 or so before the midterm. So by the 1820s, okay, what long-term developments have shaped American national identity? Because Americans have a sense of their own nationhood after the Revolution by the 1820s, which is very unique. And I'm going to give you some readings that'll help explain what that might be. My point is, when you're going back and looking at sources, you should ask yourself, okay, how does this source help me answer that question? In what ways is it relevant to that question? That'll help you, take notes. That'll help you answer those questions on the source reader, right? One of those things, actually, what's the significance of this source? Well, you can say, well, this, for example, go back to the earlier period of early colonization, right? Why one of the sources deals with, contacts between, say, the English and the Native Americans for the first time. You would say this source has significance. Why? Because it shows that the interactions between Native Americans and the English were initially not necessarily violent, well, they became that, right? And so you can talk about it later on, because the meeting of those two civilizations is part of our history and becomes part of our national identity by the 1800s. My point is, whenever you look at a source, when you're going back and doing history, again, think about note taking. How do I know what to write down? Well, you know what to write down because you have a very, very specific question you want to answer. And when you're going back and reading a source, you only need to think about that one thing. Now, I say this, you may find something sort of interesting there and may distract you from that one answer, but you have to stay focused because you don't have time to do that. But that's what I do when I'm reading sources about John Locke. Okay, how does this help me answer the question I started my article with? And I take notes based on that. And that's why I go back and look at my notes. Oh, and it's helpful because I was thinking of that question the entire time I was reading. In other words, you read with a specific purpose in mind. You don't just read to see what's there, right? Like, oh, let's see what I find. That's usually not the way you do it in history. Because, by the way, and this is why history is so interesting, you change the question, you can go back and read the exact same source, but you'll write down something else completely when you're taking notes on it. Why? Because you're asking a different question. Because there's another aspect of it you hadn't thought of before because you weren't looking for it. And so knowing what to take, knowing what notes to take, know how to respond to those response questions depends on what you want to know in a larger sense. Now, they have these, smaller questions, who wrote it, for what audience. Those are basic things. But, okay, how does all that fit into, okay, how does, for example, a source like last week you had, I believe, a primary source from Adam Smith, the great English philosopher and one of the first economists, writing about the place of the colonies in the economic life of the British Empire. How could you use that as a source for that question, that midterm question for national identity? One of the ways you can talk about it is that, of course, Americans thought of themselves as being free, of course, right? We're free. Well, what they're free to do, of course, is to make a good life, economically speaking, at least that's the American ideal, you could say, by the early 1800s. And so you could talk about that excerpt from Adam Smith's book as playing into that idea, as shaping an idea of America as a land of opportunity, where, again, there are no social barriers because there's no aristocracy. If you work hard, you can make money and you can rise up in both economic and social rank if you want to, which happens, by the way. In the early republic, that happens a lot. So that's how you would use a source in that way. And so, just to come back to note-taking, it's a different way. When you're taking notes on primary sources, again, you shouldn't ask those types of questions when you're doing the responses. But if you're taking notes on the textbook, again, you're thinking about factual stuff, like I mentioned before. So I hope that's a little more clear, helps you out a little bit. But I wanted at least address that for some of you who asked about it. The last thing I mentioned, discussion again, to come back to that. In terms of, and I've had several people in several classes mention this, in terms of the discussion schedule, you guys have done a pretty good job. You guys are pretty good at responding to your fellow classmates for the most part. But I've been thinking about ways of trying to make it more interactive for you. And one of the students in 352, I think my second section, suggested that perhaps the questions you post could be due by Friday, And then the responses to the, other students' questions can be due by Sunday. The reason being, it might develop a little more of an interaction between you students, and I think it's actually a very good idea. I would like to try it. I do want to get some feedback from you. I don't want to arbitrarily introduce that on a whim. So I'm probably sending an email out to you guys asking you about that. Because I would want you guys to get to discuss with each other a little more. I've tried in the past in some of these classes, these online classes, to have specific times where we're supposed to post. It doesn't work, obviously. You guys have different schedules, you have different needs. I tried doing a discussion chat that didn't work at all. So something like this actually sounds like a pretty good idea. And so let me know what you think. I'll go send an email out to everybody in both of my classes. Try this in both sections. And the idea, again, is to have your 3 questions should be posted by, say, Friday evening, and then your responses by Sunday evening. Again, to give you guys, okay, now you have the questions out there, you can respond a little bit more in real time, perhaps. I think I'd like you guys, and guys, when you do it, by the way, on the Reading for You discussion forums, and I'm trying to get through that stuff pretty quickly so I can give you feedback. It works great when you guys are back and forth. It really, and trust me, you guys will learn a lot when you do that, because it's hard to do, but when you get it done, talking to each other, you learn more that way, and you learn better that way. I've noticed throughout my career. So give me some feedback on that. I'll notify you about that. I'm not going to mandate that for this week, but I'll send an email out suggesting that to everybody. If a majority of people want that, we'll do that. I don't want to just impose it during the middle of the semester, but I think it's a good idea. I'd like to at least try it if you guys are okay with that. Finally, one last thing. I've gone on for about a half an hour here. I wanted to talk about the midterm. It's coming up in a few weeks. Again, I've already mentioned the actual the midterm question and topic. You should go over that again. If you haven't looked at it already, you should look at it definitely right now before you get to the great sources for this week. Which, by the way, they're good stuff on the American Revolution. You're going to have several primary sources. Couple on the stuff leading up to the Stamp Act, leading up to the Revolution, and then responses by people to the events of the Revolution. Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, talking about, hey, okay, you're complaining about rights. What about women's rights? And you have a slave petitioning the Massachusetts legislature for freedom. And so you have different responses from different actors to what's going on in the colonies. And then even at the end of those primary sources, a response later on in 1810 by the people of Venezuela who declare their independence and invoke the Declaration of Independence to support what they're doing, the American Declaration of Independence. And the secondary essay I assigned you for this week is very good by a historian named David Armitage, a British historian who's written on the British Empire. And he talks about the global impact of the Declaration of Independence and how it inspired other movements. And I've actually met Professor Armitage. He's a very brilliant historian. And I think you'll like it. It's actually an excerpt from his book on the subject, so I think you'll like that. And so we're focusing on that this week. And, we're not going to get to the actual Constitution until next week, so we're focusing on things like the Declaration of Independence for this week. Yeah, midterm. I know that I'm kind of getting out of order here, but somebody had a question in one of the forums, feedback forums, about sources. And if you look closely at the assignment, and you should take a look at the midterm module you have, I'm basically asking that you have to cite a minimum of 2 sources that you've written responses on for the semester. Let's say whatever you've written on and turned in, and you should have been turning these in, some of you haven't, you have to use 2 of those at least from what we've done so far in the semester. Again, part of the point of doing that is to get you to learn how to take notes and then utilize those notes for your essay. But you're free to use anything else in the major source book or the America textbook as sources. You're not limited to those 2 sources, is my point. You don't have to use only sources that you've written responses to. But you are limited to the assigned text for the course. You shouldn't need to use much besides the textbook or the source reader. And I know that's kind of limiting, but the question I give you is kind of broad. It's a little bit open-ended, but that's to give you some leeway. I think that the assignment's only 4 to 5 pages long. and maybe kind of difficult because you have a lot to talk about, but all you have to do is take a couple of things you think are important developments over the long term, and I give you definitions for what development is and for what long term means, by the way, in those essays, and I'll talk more about this in the coming weeks. But you should utilize those sources that you've written responses on, at least a couple of those, in addition to anything else you want to use, which is all fair game. Anything in the Major Source Problems book, or the America textbook is fair game to use. Just make sure you use a couple of those that you've written responses on for the midterm essay. Yeah, so that's basically the longest video I've had so far. I've tried to keep these short for you in terms of being a preview. The stuff for this week's it's fascinating stuff, I think. The build-up to the revolution itself, the war. I hope you guys have a good time learning about it. And again, I'm glad to hear, by the way, that you're happy with my response times, because I really do try to get back to you as soon as I can with your emails. And again, if you have any questions about the midterm, also about grading, I know some of you have asked about grading. Most of the stuff you'll find, by the way, on the grade book, in passing to remember this, are running totals. That is to say, they're only grading what you've done so far. So if it looks like you have low grades, that's because we haven't turned in much work yet, basically. And I am going to give you everybody, by the way. I think I should be an item in the grade book where it says midterm grade. It's not anything. I'm just going to give you guys a percentage and what you have grade-wise at the midterm break after about week 8 or so. So you'll have some idea where you're at in the middle of the course. So I apologize if it's not clear enough at the moment. I don't think there's any way I can give you guys. There's no function, I don't think, on Desire to Learn to give you a total grade of what you have already right now. You have to kind of add it up for yourselves, but I'll be providing that for you at the midterm point of the course. And so I think that's about it from my end for this week. Again, email me if you have any questions. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And again, thank you guys again. You guys have been great so far. It's very encouraging what you guys have done so far. I hope you guys get picking up a little bit with the quizzes, but much more so than my last classes, you guys are sticking around, which is good, and sticking with it. You guys are doing better. Most of you keep doing it. I always tell my students, you can't pass if you don't keep doing the work and staying in the class, and you guys are doing it. And I hope you guys, I know some of you already said you're getting stuff out of this. I hope you enjoy it. Again, a lot of it's self-guided anyway, so do enjoy it. Have a good time. Again, especially with this week. And again, anything I can try to do for you, I will. So have a great week. Enjoy the readings, and you'll see me next week. So take care. Have a good one.